From the loving loneliness of someone who's spiritually awakened. There are people who walk through the world differently, not because they choose to be different, but because they've seen something most haven't. They've touched a dimension of existence that changes everything. And once you've been there, once you've glimpsed what lies beneath the surface of ordinary life, you can never quite return to the comfort of not knowing. Thomas Merton understood this. He lived it. He wrote about it in the quiet hours of monastery mornings and in the depths of his contemplative solitude. He spoke of a particular kind of loneliness that comes with spiritual awakening. Not the loneliness of isolation or rejection, not the ache of being unloved or unwanted, but a loving loneliness, a sacred solitude that both connects you to everything and separates you from the noise of a sleeping world. This is the paradox no one prepares you for. That awakening to deeper truth doesn't bring you closer to people in the way you imagined. It brings you closer to existence itself, to the pulse of life that flows through all things, but it also sets you apart, and the more deeply you see, the more alone you can feel in that seeing. Because how do you explain to someone what it's like to feel the presence of eternity in a single breath? How do you share the weight of perceiving the divine in everything, when most conversations never move beyond the surface? You learn to carry something precious that very few people in your life can truly understand, and this carrying becomes its own form of love. A love that doesn't need to be understood or validated, a love that simply is. Merton called this the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful feeling of being separated from others, of being cut off from connection. But solitude, he said, is a chosen aloneness, a deliberate stepping back from the noise so you can hear the whisper of truth. And in that solitude, you're never truly alone. You're in communion with something far greater than any human relationship could contain. But here's what they don't tell you about spiritual awakening. Here's what all the beautiful books and inspiring talks leave out. The awakening doesn't just expand your consciousness, it also expands your capacity for suffering. Because when you become sensitive to the sacred, you also become sensitive to the profane. When you can feel the interconnectedness of all life, you also feel the pain of disconnection. When you see through the illusions that most people live by, you also see how much suffering those illusions create. You sit in rooms full of people and feel utterly alone, not because you're better than them or more evolved, but because you're speaking a different language now. You've been to a country they haven't visited. You've tasted something they can't yet comprehend. And the more you try to share it, the more you realize that awakening can't be taught or transmitted through words. It can only be lived. It can only be discovered in the silence of one's own heart. This is why so many spiritual seekers eventually withdraw. Not out of superiority or judgment, but out of exhaustion. The exhaustion of trying to translate the infinite into finite words. The exhaustion of living between two worlds, with one foot in ordinary reality and one foot in something that has no name. The exhaustion of caring deeply about things that seem to matter so little to the people around you. And yet, this withdrawal isn't escape. Merton knew this. He spent decades in a monastery, but he wasn't running from the world. He was learning how to love it more deeply. He was discovering that sometimes you have to step away from the crowd to truly serve the crowd. You have to find your own center before you can help others find theirs. You have to be comfortable with your own company before you can offer anything real to someone else. There's a moment in every spiritual journey where you realize you're fundamentally alone in this process. No teacher can walk the path for you. No book can give you the direct experience of what lies beyond thought. No community can carry the burden of your own transformation. You are the one who must sit with the questions that have no answers. You are the one who must face the darkness within yourself. You are the one who must learn to trust something invisible, something that can't be proven or measured or explained. And this aloneness, when you stop resisting it, becomes the doorway to everything. Because it's in the acceptance of your fundamental solitude that you discover you were never separate at all. The loneliness transforms into a loving presence that fills every corner of your awareness. The isolation becomes a spaciousness that holds all of life without grasping. The separation reveals itself to be the ultimate illusion. Merton wrote about this transformation. He described how the contemplative must descend into the desert of their own being, must face the absolute poverty of having nothing to hold on to. No beliefs, no certainties, no spiritual accomplishments. Just the naked awareness of being alive, of existing without reason or purpose, of simply being present to what is, and in that poverty, he found the richest treasure. In that emptiness, he discovered fullness. In that silence, he heard the voice of God. But let's be clear about something. This isn't easy. This isn't some romantic notion of spiritual enlightenment where you float above the problems of ordinary life. The loving loneliness of the awakened soul is often accompanied by real pain. The pain of being misunderstood, the pain of not fitting in, the pain of seeing so clearly what others can't see and feeling powerless to wake them up, the pain of loving a world that seems determined to destroy itself. You watch people chase after things you once chased, and you remember. You remember how much it mattered, how urgent it all seemed. The career, the relationship, the recognition, the security, and you don't judge them for it. You can't. Because you know that everyone is exactly where they need to be. Everyone is learning the lessons they came here to learn. But knowing this doesn't make it easier to watch. It doesn't make it easier to love people who are suffering from illusions you can now see through. And so you learn a new kind of love. A love that doesn't need the other person to change or awaken or understand. A love that can hold them exactly as they are, even when it breaks your heart to see them trapped in patterns of pain. A love that knows the ultimate truth, that beneath all the confusion and fear and grasping, there is only consciousness experiencing itself in infinite forms. And every form is sacred. Every form is exactly as it should be. This is what Merton meant by loving loneliness. It's not about withdrawing into bitterness or superiority. It's about finding a love so vast that it doesn't need anything from anyone. A love that can sit in silence with you while the world goes about its business. A love that asks nothing, demands nothing, expects nothing. A love that simply witnesses and allows and embraces what is. But this kind of love requires something of you. It requires that you be willing to stand alone, to trust your own direct experience even when it contradicts everything you've been taught, to follow the thread of truth wherever it leads, even if it leads you away from everyone you know, even if it leads you into a solitude so profound that no words can describe it. There's a strange alchemy that happens in this solitude, a transformation that can't be rushed or forced. You enter it carrying all your wounds, all your questions, all your desperate need for answers. And slowly, without you even noticing, the weight begins to shift. The questions that once tormented you lose their urgency, not because you found answers, but because you've discovered something deeper than answers. You've discovered the presence that holds all questions without needing to resolve them. Merton wrote extensively about this process. He called it the dark night of the soul, borrowing from John of the Cross. But it's not just one night, it's many nights. Many long stretches of time where you feel like you're losing everything you thought defined you. Your certainties crumble, your beliefs dissolve. Your sense of who you are becomes so fluid that sometimes you wake up and don't recognize the person looking back at you in the mirror. And in those moments, when everything familiar has fallen away, you have a choice. You can panic and try to rebuild your old identity, to grasp at the fragments of who you used to be. Or you can let yourself fall completely, into the unknowing, into the void, into the vast emptiness that your whole life has been structured to avoid. Most people choose to rebuild. They can't bear the nakedness of having no solid ground beneath their feet. They rush back to the comfort of certainty, even if that certainty is a prison. But some people, the ones who walk the path of loving loneliness, they make a different choice. They let themselves fall. And in that falling, they discover something miraculous. There is no bottom. The void they feared is actually infinite space. The emptiness they tried to avoid is actually fullness beyond measure. This is the initiation that spiritual awakening demands, not a single dramatic moment of enlightenment, but a long, slow surrender to not knowing. A daily practice of releasing your grip on everything you think you understand. A willingness to be wrong, to be confused, to be completely lost in the wilderness of your own consciousness. And it's lonely. God, it's lonely. Because you can't explain this process to anyone who hasn't been through it. You can't make them understand why you're questioning everything, why you're letting go of beliefs they still cling to, why you're walking away from a life that looks perfectly good from the outside. They see you changing, and they get scared. They try to pull you back to who you used to be, back to the comfortable predictability of the person they knew. But you can't go back. Once you've seen through the illusion, you can't unsee it. Once you've tasted the freedom that comes from letting go, you can't return to the prison of fixed identity. You have to keep walking forward, even when forward means walking alone. Even when the loneliness feels like it might break you open. And maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe you need to be broken open, because the person you thought you were isn't big enough to hold the truth you're discovering. The small self, the ego, the personality you've been defending and protecting your whole life, it's too tight, too constricting. It has to crack apart so that something larger can emerge. Merton understood this breaking open. He experienced it again and again throughout his life. Every time he thought he'd found his place, his purpose, his identity, life would come and shatter it. And each shattering brought him closer to the truth, closer to the realization that he wasn't any fixed thing at all. He was the space in which all things arose and dissolved. He was the awareness that witnessed the whole dance without being caught in it. This is what the loving loneliness prepares you for. It strips away everything that isn't essential. It burns off all the false identities, all the pretenses, all the ways you've learned to perform for others. And what remains, when everything else has been burned away, is something so simple and so profound that you almost can't believe you spent your whole life overlooking it. You remain. Not the you that has a story and a history and a personality, but the you that simply is. The consciousness that's aware of being conscious. The presence that exists before thought, before emotion, before any sense of separation or individuality. That's what remains. And that presence is never alone because it is everything. But here's the paradox. To realize this, you first have to go through the feeling of complete aloneness. You have to experience yourself as utterly separate, as an isolated island of consciousness in a vast ocean of otherness. You have to feel the full weight of being this particular person, with this particular perspective, cut off from everyone and everything else. Most spiritual teachings skip over this part. They jump straight to the unity consciousness, to the realization that we're all one. But Merton didn't skip it. He sat with the loneliness. He let it teach him. He understood that the journey to unity has to pass through the valley of profound solitude. You can't know yourself as everything until you've first fully experienced yourself as this one small thing, separate and alone. This is why the loving loneliness is so important. It's not just a phase to get through on the way to something better. It's a crucial part of the journey itself. It's the initiation that prepares you for the ultimate revelation. Because when you've been alone with yourself, really alone with no distractions and no escape routes, you discover something that no one can take away from you. You discover your own inherent completeness. You realize you don't need anything or anyone to make you whole. You were always whole. The loneliness wasn't a sign of something missing. It was the feeling of coming home to yourself, of no longer abandoning yourself in search of validation from the outside world. The aloneness wasn't isolation. It was integrity. The experience of being undivided, unconflicted, at peace with your own existence. And from that place of internal wholeness, you can finally meet others authentically. You can love without neediness. You can connect without losing yourself. You can be intimate without merging. Because you've learned to stand in your own space, to honor your own solitude, to protect the sacred aloneness that is the foundation of your being. Merton spent years learning this lesson. In the monastery, surrounded by other monks, he had to constantly negotiate the balance between community and solitude. He had to learn when to engage and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer his presence and when to protect his inner sanctuary. And through all of that learning, he developed a wisdom that very few people ever attain. He learned that true community is only possible between people who have first found their own center, that real intimacy requires the ability to be alone, that the deepest connections happen between individuals who don't need each other to feel complete. This is the paradox of spiritual relationship. The more comfortable you are with your own solitude, the more available you become for genuine connection. But most people never learn this. They move through life desperately trying to avoid being alone. They fill every moment with noise and distraction and other people's company because they're terrified of what they might find if they ever stopped and listened to themselves. They mistake enmeshment for intimacy, dependency for love, constant togetherness for connection, and then they wonder why their relationships feel empty, why they can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely, why even their closest connections seem to lack depth and authenticity. It's because they're not bringing their true selves to those relationships. They're bringing their need, their fear, their desperate attempt to avoid facing their own inner emptiness. The person who has embraced the loving loneliness brings something entirely different to relationship. They bring presence. They bring fullness. They bring a capacity to see and appreciate the other person without trying to use them to fill some inner void. They've learned to be their own source of love, their own best company, their own home. And from that foundation, they can truly meet another person. Not to complete themselves, but to share the overflow of their own completeness. This is the gift that comes from walking through the fire of spiritual solitude. You stop being desperate. You stop grasping. You stop trying to extract from others what you need to give yourself. And in that stopping, you become truly available. For love, for connection, for the kind of intimacy that doesn't diminish either person, but allows both to flourish. Merton lived this. Even in his final years, when he fell in love with a young nurse and experienced the full force of romantic passion, he understood that real love required him to maintain his solitude. He couldn't abandon the foundation of his spiritual life, even for love, because he knew that if he did, he would lose the very thing that made his love genuine. He would lose his center, his ground, his connection to the source. And so he chose differently. He chose the loving loneliness over the comfort of constant companionship. Not because he didn't value relationship, but because he valued it so much that he refused to corrupt it with neediness and dependency. He understood that the deepest love is the one that can hold separation without breaking, the one that can honor both togetherness and solitude, the one that recognizes that each person is complete in themselves, and their union is not about filling lack, but about celebrating fullness. This is perhaps the hardest teaching for the awakened soul to embody, because even after all the realizations, even after touching the infinite, you still live in a human body with human needs and human desires. You still long for touch, for companionship, for someone to witness and understand your journey. You still feel the pull of relationship, the desire to merge with another, to lose yourself in love. And here's the secret that Merton discovered in his years of contemplation. Here's what he tried to tell us through his journals and his poetry and his late-night musings. The loneliness doesn't last forever. Or rather, it transforms into something else entirely. Into a companionship with existence itself, into a friendship with the present moment, into a love affair with reality just as it is. You begin to notice things you never noticed before. The way light falls through leaves, the sound of rain on a roof, the feeling of breath moving in and out of your body, the miracle of being conscious in a universe that has no obligation to be conscious at all. And in these simple moments, you find a richness that no relationship or achievement could ever match. Not because those things aren't valuable, but because this richness was always there, beneath everything, waiting for you to slow down enough to notice it. The world becomes more vivid, not less. Colors are brighter, sounds are clearer. Everything seems to shimmer with an aliveness you missed when you were caught up in the drama of your own story. And you realize that the loneliness you felt wasn't about being separate from others. It was about being separate from this, from the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive. Merton spent hours sitting in silence, watching, listening, being. People thought he was escaping, but he was doing the opposite. He was arriving. He was finally showing up for his own life in a way that most people never do. He was learning to be present to the full catastrophe and beauty of existence without needing it to be different, without needing himself to be different. And in that radical acceptance, something miraculous happens. The boundaries you thought were so solid begin to dissolve. You realize you're not a separate self looking at the world from the inside of your head. You're the world looking at itself. Your consciousness exploring its own nature, through this particular form, this particular perspective. And every other being is the same consciousness wearing a different costume, playing a different role in the great drama of existence. So the loneliness you felt, the isolation of being awake in a sleeping world, it was just consciousness learning to recognize itself. It was the necessary stage of separation before the ultimate reunion. You had to feel yourself as distinct, as alone, as other, before you could discover that there is no other. There is only this awareness, this presence, this love that has nowhere to go because it already is everything. But even knowing this, even experiencing it directly in moments of grace, you still live in a human body. You still have a personality with preferences and aversions. You still exist in a world where most people are operating from a very different paradigm. And so the loving loneliness remains, but it changes texture. It becomes less painful and more peaceful, less like exile and more like sanctuary. You find yourself drawn to silence, to solitude, to the company of trees and rivers and the vast sky. Not because you hate people, but because you need to recharge. You need to return to the source again and again, to remember what's real when the world seems determined to convince you that only the surface matters. You need to sit with the loving loneliness and let it remind you of who you really are. And sometimes, rarely but beautifully, you meet someone else who knows. Someone else who has walked through the fire of awakening and come out the other side. And in those moments, the loneliness dissolves completely. You look in their eyes and you see yourself. You speak in the language of depth and they understand every word without explanation. You share a silence that contains more intimacy than 1,000 conversations about nothing. These meetings are grace. They're gifts from the universe to remind you that you're not crazy, not broken, not wrong for seeing what you see. They're confirmations that the path is real, that others have walked it, that you're part of an invisible lineage of seekers and finders, of mystics and contemplatives who have all discovered the same truth in their own unique way. But even these meetings don't eliminate the fundamental aloneness of the journey. Because ultimately, you're the only one who can walk your path. You're the only one who can face your particular demons and integrate your particular shadows. You're the only one who can learn to love your specific constellation of wounds and gifts. No one else can do your awakening for you. This is what makes it a loving loneliness. It's not cold or bitter or resentful. It's warm with acceptance. It's soft with compassion. It's gentle with understanding. You're alone, yes, but you're alone in love, surrounded by love, held by love, breathing love with every breath. Merton understood that true solitude isn't about physical isolation. You can be alone in a crowd or surrounded by people in your solitude. True solitude is an inner state. It's the ability to be with yourself without distraction, without entertainment, without the constant noise that most people use to avoid facing the depths of their own being. It's the willingness to sit with whatever arises, pleasant or unpleasant, beautiful or terrifying, and simply be present to it. And in that presence you discover something extraordinary. You discover that you're not as small as you thought you were, that the consciousness you are extends far beyond the boundaries of your body and your personal story, that you are in some inexplicable way connected to everything that exists, that the loneliness you felt was just the ego's fear of its own dissolution. And beneath that fear is an oceanic feeling of belonging to something so vast and so beautiful that it brings tears to your eyes. This is the gift of spiritual awakening that nobody tells you about. Yes, it brings challenges. Yes, it sets you apart. Yes, it requires you to walk a path that very few people understand. But it also gives you access to a dimension of experience that makes everything worthwhile, a dimension where every moment is fresh and new, where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where you fall in love with existence itself. And so you learn to embrace the loving loneliness. You learn to see it not as a problem to be solved, but as a doorway to be entered. You learn that in your willingness to be alone, you become available to everyone. In your acceptance of solitude, you discover true intimacy. In your capacity to sit with silence, You hear the song that the whole universe is singing. Merton spent his last years writing about this paradox, about how the contemplative life isn't an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with it. About how silence isn't the absence of communication, but the fullest expression of it. About how solitude isn't isolation, but the most profound form of connection. He knew that the person who can be truly alone is the person who can be truly present with others, because they're not bringing their neediness, their desperation for validation, their fear of emptiness. They're bringing presence, they're bringing spaciousness, they're bringing a love that doesn't depend on getting anything back. They've found the source of love within themselves in their own solitude, and so they can share it freely without attachment or expectation. This is the gift of the awakened soul to the world, not their teachings or their wisdom or their spiritual accomplishments, but their capacity to love without needing anything in return. And this capacity grows directly from the loving loneliness, from the hours spent in silence, learning to be with yourself, from the dark nights of the soul where you had no choice but to face your own demons, from the moments of profound isolation where you realized that the only way out was through. Every experience of aloneness that you fully embraced has deepened your capacity to love. Every moment of loneliness that you've sat with rather than run from has expanded your heart. So if you're reading this and recognizing yourself, if you know the loving loneliness of the spiritually awakened soul, know this: you're not alone in your aloneness. There are others walking this path, others who understand the strange paradox of feeling both more connected and more isolated than ever before, others who have learned to make peace with the silence, to befriend the solitude, to embrace the sacred loneliness that comes with seeing clearly. And know that what you're experiencing isn't a problem. It's not a sign that something's wrong with you, or that you've taken a wrong turn. It's the natural consequence of waking up. It's what happens when consciousness becomes aware of itself. It's the price and the privilege of seeing beyond the veil of illusion. The world needs people like you, people who can hold the tension between belonging and solitude, people who can love deeply without losing themselves, people who can speak truth even when it means standing alone, people who can see through the collective dream and help others wake up from it. But first, you have to learn to stand in your own loving loneliness. You have to become so comfortable with your own company that you no longer need the world to validate your experience. And when you reach that place, something shifts. The loneliness doesn't disappear, but it loses its sting. It becomes a friend, a companion, a trusted advisor. It becomes the space where you meet yourself, where you meet life, where you meet the divine. It becomes your sanctuary, your refuge, your home. Merton found this home in the monastery, in the woods, in the silence of his hermitage. But the home he found wasn't a place. It was a state of being, a way of relating to existence that didn't depend on external circumstances, a love that could hold both the darkness and the light, both the joy and the sorrow, both the connection and the separation. And in the end, that's what the loving loneliness teaches you, that you're large enough to contain it all, that your heart is vast enough to hold every paradox, every contradiction, every mystery, that you don't have to choose between solitude and communion, between silence and speech, between withdrawal and engagement. You can embrace it all. You can be all of it, because you are all of it. You are the consciousness that experiences both connection and separation. You are the love that exists in relationship and in solitude. You are the witness and the witnessed, the lover and the beloved, the seeker and the sought. And the loving loneliness is just one more face of the infinite expressing itself through your unique form. So walk your path with courage. Embrace your solitude with grace. Love your loneliness as you would love a cherished friend. Because in that embrace, you'll find everything you've been looking for. Not outside yourself, not in another person, not in any achievement or awakening, but right here, right now, in the silence of your own being. This is what Merton was trying to tell us all along, that the monastery isn't a place you go to, it's a space you create within yourself, a space of loving awareness that can hold anything and everything, a space where you're finally, completely, totally at home, alone but not lonely, separate but not isolated, awake in a sleeping world, carrying a love too large for words, and maybe that's the greatest gift of all. Not the awakening itself, but the love that survives the awakening. The love that remains when all the illusions have fallen away. The love that asks nothing, expects nothing, needs nothing. The love that simply is, has always been, and will always be. Waiting patiently in the silence for you to stop running, stop seeking, stop searching, and finally come home to yourself. This is the loving loneliness of the spiritually awakened soul. Not a burden to be endured, but a blessing to be cherished. Not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a love affair with existence itself, the beginning of true freedom, the beginning of coming home.